Oh, God. Sorry. Hello, true crimers. Oh, that was just rude, but you know what? Whatever. Anyway, hello, true crimers. This is going to be a compilation video from my TikTok page. This is continuing the On This Day in True Crime History series that I have over on TikTok. So these will be all of the videos that I made for On This Day in True Crime History for the month of June. I did not do these every single day, so yes, there will be gaps of time. But anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it. Please make sure you subscribe if you're new to my channel. I do tell full-length true crime stories with just one story a video, at least 3 or 4 times a week. But then I throw these compilations in as much as I can to make sure I have all my TikTok videos before TikTok says sayonara to my page. If you can, please also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the whole kit and caboodle. All of it's listed below in the description and in the link tree. Yeah, I got merch. It's also in the link tree. I got a Discord if you want to join it. It's in the link tree. What else? What else am I supposed to say? I don't know. Have fun. Here you go. Viewer discretion is advised. Yeehaw. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 1st. What happened on June 1st? June 1st, 2004, the penalty phase of this man's trial would begin. Who is this? This is Mr. Terry Nichols. What did he do? Well, this was once the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning on April 19th, 1995, a man by the name of Timothy McVeigh would drive a Ryder's moving van filled with explosives, and you can see it in the CCTV footage way there in the back. He would park it in their drop-off zone, which was just under the building's daycare center. He would then flee the area, and at 9:02 a.m., the truck filled with 4,800 pounds of explosive material would detonate. This was the result. The bomb detonated with 646 people inside the building. 168 people would lose their lives. This included children, pregnant women, elderly people. It is the worst domestic terrorist attack we've ever faced. Timothy McVeigh was very anti-government, as was his buddy Terry Nichols. Terry actually grew up a very intelligent individual, and he was well on his way to becoming a medical professional. But after spending some time in the U.S. Army, which is where he met Timothy McVeigh, and befriending someone like him, the two of them would watch the Waco siege unfold, and they thought, you know what, we should take revenge on the government. Now, the Oklahoma City bombing was Timothy McVeigh's thing. This was his baby. But Terry helped get the supplies needed. He rented storage units to store the bombing materials. They would actually use one of Terry Nichols's family's farm to store like fertilizer. Terry knew what was going to happen. He knew Timothy's plan. Now, he was not there in Oklahoma City the day of the bombing. Only Timothy McVeigh was. He did not detonate the bomb. As a matter of fact, he attempted to back out of this whole plan a few days prior. Timothy would then say, like, you know, you're not a man then. But the two of them would eventually be arrested for this. Timothy McVeigh was sentenced to death, and he has since been executed. He would be convicted in federal court, but also in state court for the 168 counts of murder. On June 1st, 2004, he would get life in prison over the death penalty. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 2nd. What happened on June 2nd? 18-year-old Kelsie Smith was seen walking out of a Target, and then she was never seen alive again. Kelsie had just graduated high school not but a few weeks prior to this story. She lived in the Overland Park, Kansas area. She had a boyfriend that she loved very much. On June 2nd, 2007, she had gone to this Target to purchase some gifts for her boyfriend. She was seen walking inside the store a little before 7 p.m. that day. At exactly 7:07 p.m., Kelsie walked out with her purchase. Just a minute or so after this, she gives her mom a call, and Kelsie was expected to be home very shortly, but she never made it home. Before her family could do anything like report her missing, her car would be found. It was found just across the street from where she had last been seen. All of her stuff was still in there, her purse, her wallet, keys, everything, the items she bought. So police at this point were like, okay, she likely was taken by someone. And by looking at CCTV footage of the parking lot, they confirmed it. I can't seem to find the image of the Parcho See No Evil. I remember seeing this case on there before. And I think they show you that there is a moment around 7:10 p.m. where a man comes up next to her at her car and forces her inside of the passenger seat of her own vehicle. And then the car drives away. And then CCTV finds an image of the same person dropping her vehicle off at the mall parking lot at 9:17 p.m. Sadly, a few days later on June 6, 2007, the body of Kelsie Smith would be discovered. She was found roughly 20 miles away from where she was last seen. She had been strangled to death, and it was obvious that she was sexually assaulted. Police would once again look through the CCTV footage of that Target. 30 seconds after Kelsie walks in, this man walks in. He is then seen kind of lingering around her in the store, and then after she leaves, he is seen leaving the building. He is then seen on CCTV walking towards where her car was, where it was seen that she was forced inside. Police would go on the news and release this blown-up image of the man, and on June 6th, the day her body was found, the man was identified by an acquaintance. It was 26-year-old Edwin Roy Hall. Why does he look like he's about to start talking about womblands? Anyway, he was arrested as he was trying to leave town. He would end up pleading guilty to the murder. This was just a random attack. Kelsie was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 3rd. What happened on June 3rd? This was Kimberly Compton. She was 18 years old. Unfortunately, I cannot find too much personal information about her, but by June 3rd, 1981, she had just graduated high school and just moved to St. Paul, Minnesota. On the night of June 3rd, 1981, sadly, her body would be discovered by a couple of teenage boys. She had been stabbed 61 times, and there were signs that her killer also tried to strangle her with a rope. Later that evening, police would get a phone call. A phone call from Paul Michael Stefani. He would call police confessing to murdering Kimberly Compton. After the 911 operator picked up the phone, he would say, "Don't talk, just listen. God, do you find me? I just stabbed somebody with an ice pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody." If you think I'm joking with that silly voice, go ahead and go on YouTube and look up the phone calls of the Weepy Voice Killer. He was nicknamed the Weepy Voice Killer after he called each time he murdered someone, begging police to find him. Now, I've made a video about him before, so I'm not going to go into all the details. Kimberly Compton was the second woman he attacked, but his first murder. He would kill 3 women total. He was convicted of the murders and sentenced to 40 years in prison, where he died of cancer in 1998. Again, look up the Weepy Voice Killer phone calls on YouTube, and be careful listening to them at night, because they are nightmare-inducing. But that is what happened on this day in true crime history. We will see you for the next edition, folks. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. And today is June 4th. What happened on June 4th? Well, this is Charles Ng. And this was his buddy, Leonard Lake. On June 4th, 1985, San Francisco police would uncover the bunker of these two men. It was their hostage bunker, if you will. Charles Ng was born in 1960 in British Hong Kong. Leonard Lake was born in 1945 in San Francisco, California. Both men would go through troubled times during their youth. You know, the usual. There was abuse by the parents, a lot of alcohol consumption. Leonard was very creepy. When he was younger, he liked to take photos of his sister nude. Both men would join the U.S. Marines at different times, of course. In 1981, the two of them would meet through a survivalist magazine they both read. Leonard and his wife owned a little property in Wilseyville, and this is in California. Leonard would build an additional, bunker of sorts with, underground tunnels and whatnot. Now, Charles was serving time for a military crime. By 1984, he regrouped with Leonard and joined him at that cabin that he had built. Both men had very disturbing, sadistic minds. For whatever reason going on upstairs, they wanted to torture people. It was a match made in heaven, I suppose. Over the course of time, they would lure several people to this cabin. We're talking husbands, wives, babies, older children. They would just take the babies, the children, and the husbands and just murder them from the get-go. But they would keep the women and tie them up and treat them like they were slaves. They had a set of rules, like I must always be ready to service my master. I must be clean, brushed, and made up with my cell neat. Go ahead and pause to read this if you like. It's yeah. They would also record their crimes. There was a bunch of found footage discovered that showed their sadistic ways, torturing women, sexually assaulting them, and then when they were through with them, they would just kill them and go about their daily business. Now, obviously, all these people would be reported missing, and eventually, because of witnesses, Charles Ng would be linked to some of these missing people, and then that would then link him to Leonard Lake. On June 4th, 1985, they were able to invade the bunker, where they uncovered so many human remains that were just burnt to powder. They have 11 confirmed victims, but it's believed they killed at least 25. Leonard Lake ended his own life with a cyanide capsule. Charles was convicted and sentenced to death, but that was overturned and he got life in prison. Hello and good evening, true crimer people. The that? It is time for another Let's try that again. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. And today is June 4th. Nope. Today is actually June 5th. This is what I get when I film ahead of time. Anyway, what happened on June 5th, you may ask? Well, a couple things. In the early morning hours of June 5th, 1968, after giving a speech at the Ambassador Hotel, located in Los Angeles, California, Senator Robert Kennedy would be shot dead and assassinated. He was killed by a man named Sirhan Sirhan. His killer would eventually get the death penalty, but then the death penalty was repealed in California, so therefore his conviction was changed to life in prison with a possibility of parole. But Sirhan Sirhan has been denied parole every single time. What else happened on June 5th? I know you're asking, and I'm going to tell you. What the fuck is wrong with me? Pictured here was the lovely Marie Dighton. She would go by Frida. She was 67 years old and she lived in Buffalo Valley, Oklahoma. On June 5th, 2008, one of her daughters called the police to do a welfare check on her because she was sick and she had not heard from her mother. When police arrived, the vehicles were in the driveway, and the house was locked. So police had to call the daughter, and the daughter said, yes, please go ahead and enter the house. When they got in the house, they went into her bedroom and they found her lifeless body. At first, police were like she died of natural causes, which was strange because she had actually been stabbed multiple times. Her throat had actually been cut and she had at least 9 stab wounds over her chest, back, and throat. She also had knife wounds on her hand, so she tried to fight back. Police have released nothing about the crime scene. They are keeping it very hush-hush. A lot of times they'll do that so they can secure information so that when they do find a suspect and that suspect says something about the crime scene, they know that they're talking to the right person. There is a $15,000 reward for any information about her murder, but her case sadly is unsolved. They apparently have very little to go on. They have not arrested anyone. It's just like, who would do this to such a, a nice older lady? But that is what happened on this day in true crime history. We shall see you for the next edition, folks. Hello and good evening, true crimeers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. And today is June 7th. What happened on June 7th? Well, the butchering of whatever accident that was. Sorry to all of those who were affected by that. Well, a few things happened on June 7th. Let's take a peeksy poops. This fella, well, he was Samuel Little. He was born on June 7th, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia. What is he known for, huh? Well, he is considered America's most prolific serial killer. He was convicted of 60 confirmed murders. These are drawings done by Samuel Little of some of his victims. He would begin his criminal life with thefts and robberies. He would spend time in jail. He would go on to confess to 93 murders, and he had a very vivid memory of all of them. Police were only ever able to truly confirm 60 of them, making him the most confirmed kills serial killer in United States history. And he killed women across 19 different states, and he was doing this for 35 years, and he finally stopped in 2005. He died in prison in 2020. What else happened on June 7th? Well, this was James Byrd Jr. I actually covered his case before. But on June 7th, 1998, he was brutally tortured and murdered by white supremacists. And this happened in Jasper, Texas. He was tied behind a pickup truck and dragged for miles across the asphalt. His killers were caught and sentenced to prison. One of them was executed by lethal injection. And one more case happened on June 7th. Also on June 7th, 1998, but this was in Barberton, Ohio. 58-year-old grandmother Judith Johnson was sexually assaulted and murdered in her own home. Her 6-year-old granddaughter, who was there at the time, was also sexually assaulted, and the killer tried to kill her too, but she survived. The granddaughter would testify that the person looked a lot like Uncle Clarence, which was 35-year-old Clarence Elkins. Even though there was absolutely no physical evidence tying him to the scene, including DNA, the DNA found on the body was conclusively not his. He was still convicted in 1999. He got life in prison without parole because of the testimony of his niece. It wouldn't be until the Innocence Project got involved in his story, when by 2007, thanks to DNA testing, they were finally able to get his conviction overturned, because the DNA actually matched this man, the literal next-door neighbor to Judith. His name was Earl Mann. The niece actually went to his house after the incident to get help. The woman who answered the door, she made the little girl wait outside because she knew. Extra, extra, and good evening, true crimers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 9th. What happened on June 9th, pray tell? This grey fella pictured here was murdered. Nay, assassinated. And dear God, I will not keep doing this voice. This was Jake Lingle of Chicago, Illinois. Jake was I guess you can call him a backdoor reporter for the Chicago Tribune. He did not actually write anything for them, and his name was never really credited on anything. But he was the guy who always got information. He phoned the information into the actual writers, and then they were the ones who wrote stories. He tended to specialize in gang-related crimes. He even interviewed Mr. Al Capone. Jake just seemed to always get the best information from these types of cases. gang-style stuff. On the afternoon of June 9th, 1930, there I go again. Lingle was on his way to catch a 1:30 train to a racetrack. He was one who liked to, bet on horses. As he was going through the terminal, and he's behind me here, can't show him because TikTok will be mad at me. As he was walking through the terminal, he was reading a newspaper, smoking a cigar, and all of a sudden, boom, one shot rang out. Witnesses said there appeared to be two men who were tailing Lingle. One of them was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed fella carrying a .38 revolver. Once the shots rang out, the two men dispersed. Police would chase one, but would lose him. Lingle had been shot one time through the back of the head, went through his brain and out his forehead. He fell, still holding the newspaper in his hand. The newspapers would offer a whole bunch of money in rewards. This would equal out to be somewhere around $900,000 in 2022 money. This is when some shady information came out. You see, Lingle wasn't just good at getting information. Turns out he was part of the information. He was working with some of the gangs in the area. He was described as someone who would sell favors. And his bank account had a whole lot more money than any news reporter should ever have. We're talking somewhere in the sum of about $100,000 when he only got paid about $60 a week. There were theories that Al Capone hired the hit because Lingle had somehow crossed him. Another gangster by the name of Jack Zuda was also rumored to be involved. Ultimately, it was this man, Leo Vincent Brothers, a low-level gangster. He was arrested and charged with the murder. Most people believe he was not the one to actually do it, but he was really just taking the fall for someone else. Regardless, he would be convicted and only got 14 years. He only served 8 of those years. And somehow his death still remains a mystery. And that is what happened on this day in true crime history. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 10th. What happened on June 10th? On the morning of June 10th, 1991, Jaycee Dugard would be kidnapped. Jaycee and her family lived in Antioch, California. And on that morning of June 10th, 1991, she was on her way to the bus stop to get to school. When, all of a sudden, in front of witnesses, a vehicle would pull up to where Jaycee was, and the driver took out a taser and tased her. Then a woman got out of the car and dragged her inside the car. The woman would then cover Jaycee with a blanket. Philip and Nancy Garrido. They took Jaycee 120 miles away from where she lived to their property in Antioch, California. Jaycee's family would report her missing. Her stepfather actually witnessed the kidnapping take place, and he even tried to catch up with the car on a bike. That being said, the stepfather and her birth father were both investigated, and they were both cleared. Her own biological father didn't even know he had a daughter. Jaycee was taken to this home. Looks nice enough. Looks can be deceiving. This was the backyard of that property. Philip had constructed soundproof sheds. He had a bunch of tents back there. They would handcuff Jaycee inside one of those sheds and strip her naked. Over the course of time, Philip would sexually assault Jaycee over and over and over again. He even got her pregnant twice. And she would give birth to 2 girls. At one point, Philip was actually arrested for a different crime, and he spent time in prison. But police never looked in his backyard. In fact, the cops were called to that property on more than one occasion, but they never saw anything back there, because they never checked. Nancy here would go back and forth between treating Jaycee as she was her mother, and then she would flip to completely berating the young girl. Later down the road, as Jaycee got older, they allowed her to do more things outside of the shed. At one point, she even worked for them in public. She does not like the idea of using the term Stockholm Syndrome, but she basically communicated with her captors as a way of defense, just agreeing with everything they say, doing what they want you to do. On August 26, 2009, Jaycee was at a parole office with her captor and also her 2 daughters. At first, she was being really defensive to the officers, but then Philip confessed. He told them exactly what he did. He and Nancy were both arrested. Jaycee was finally free of her captors. Philip was sentenced to 431 years. Nancy got 36 years. Hello and good evening, true crimeers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 11th. What happened on June 11th, you ask? I tell. Well, this American domestic terrorist, Timothy McVeigh, was executed. After murdering 168 people at the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, by blowing the building up, he was convicted and sentenced to death. On June 11th, 2001, he was strapped to the table at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana, and he was executed by lethal injection. Did anything else happen on June 11th? Absolutely. On June 11th, 1977, a 20-day-long hostage crisis would end in bloodshed. On May 23, 1977, a train was hijacked by 9 perpetrators. And this actually happened in the Netherlands. 9 armed Moluccan nationalists took the train hostage in response to essentially the Dutch government failing them. They had previously fought for the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies. And then after they fought for them, they were exiled to the Netherlands. The Dutch government promised that they would find a secure home for them. They were promised their own independent state. But it never came. They never fulfilled their end of the deal, the Dutch government. 25 years later, the South Moluccans decided to take actions into their own hands. This crisis began on May 23, 1977. They made their demands by setting an ultimatum, which then the Dutch response was nothing. But then the captors, they didn't do anything to the hostages. The hostage takers then set themselves another ultimatum. And once again, the Dutch responded by doing nothing. Essentially by calling their bluff, is what it sounds like. Not thinking that they would actually kill any hostages. And technically they were right, they didn't. 482 hours into the hostage crisis on June 11th, 1977, the Royal Netherlands Air Force would fly just above the train, and they used their afterburners, which essentially were so loud that it deafened everyone. The hostages would drop to the ground, and then the counter-terrorist forces that were outside the train, well, they began firing into it, and they fired 15,000 rounds into the train. 6 of the 9 hostage takers were killed, as were, unfortunately, 2 of the hostages. Not killed by the hostage takers, but by those who were trying to save them. The remaining 3 hijackers were convicted of their crime, and each got 9 years in jail. And that's what happened on this day in true crime history. Stay tuned for the next! Hello and good evening, true crimeers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 12th. What happened on June 12th? Quite a bit. On June 12th, 2016, at the gay nightclub Pulse, located in Orlando, Florida, a 29-year-old man armed with guns would go through and begin shooting. He would murder 49 people and injure at least 53 more, and then the shooter would end up losing his own life in the shootout with the police. These are the faces of the 49 victims that he took that night. I did cover this case in more detail last year during Pride Month, so that case will be in my Cases of the Marginalized playlist. What else happened on June 12th? Believe it or not, another major story. Well, pictured here was the home of Nicole Brown Simpson. She had been married to NFL star O.J. Simpson. They had a very tumultuous relationship. O.J. Simpson would abuse Nicole on the regular. There were police reports filed, and it was just a very messy relationship. Nicole put up with a hell of a lot. In 1992, Nicole would file for divorce from O.J., but they still kind of had a little bit of a thing going. On October 25th, 1993, Nicole would call 911 saying that O.J. was going to beat the shit out of her. And following that, the relationship would then end for good. Nicole then lived in this Brentwood home, and on the evening of June 12th, 1994, Nicole and a friend of hers, Ron Goldman, well, they would both be stabbed to death. And this would occur on the walkway of her home. Nicole was stabbed so many times and so violently that her head had almost been cut off. O.J. Simpson then became a suspect and eventually was charged with 2 counts of murder, went through a very famous and very long trial where evidence certainly pointed towards his guilt. The gloves clearly fit, by the way, and he was found not guilty. Years later, he would essentially write a book and tell people, essentially, if I killed Nicole, this is how I would have done it. Essentially confessing. There's nothing they can do because he's already been acquitted, so he can say whatever he wants. One more story. This was Medgar Evers. He was a civil rights activist. He became very involved in trying to desegregate schools, buses, you name it. He was paramount in helping with voter registration. He led marches and protests, and he made enemies with white supremacists. On the morning of June 12, 1963, after pulling into his driveway, Medgar was shot once through the heart by a white supremacist, and eventually his killer will be sentenced to life in prison. Oh, well, hello and good evening, true crimerers. Guess what? It's time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 14th. What happened on June 14th? Well, some of these peeps did some bad things to some of the other peeps here, yeah. This was Judge Curtis Chillingworth, and he resided with his wife Marjorie in Palm Beach, Florida. He was a good judge, one who followed the law, as any judge should do. Okay, this is the star of Hotel Transylvania, otherwise known as Judge Joseph Peel. He was a West Palm Beach municipal judge. He also still acted as a lawyer, which I did not know you could do. In 1953, he did something really just dumb. During a divorce settlement, he represented both the husband and the wife, which is, I don't need to tell you, very unethical. And his superior, Judge Chillingworth, he told him as much. In fact, Judge Chillingworth publicly dragged Judge Peel, saying that the next time he did something like that, he would be disbarred. And Judge Pointy Nose here did not like that. Fast forward to 1955, he's representing another woman who's going through a divorce. He told the woman that the divorce was done, it was final. When in fact, it wasn't. Because later the woman would be labeled a bigamist because she married someone else, not realizing her divorce never went through. Judge Chillingworth was not going to have it anymore, so Judge Peel decided to do something drastic. On the night of June 14th, 1955, Judge Chillingworth and his wife Marjorie would go out for dinner. They would then return to their beachside cottage around 10 o'clock that night, and then they were never heard from or seen again. When the judge didn't show up for work, the police were sent to their cottage. I guess cottage also means mansion, where they noticed blood trails going down to the beach. Footprints were in the sand. Something was amiss. A man by the name of Floyd Hosefeld would start bragging that he knew who killed the judge. So police tricked him and got a recorded confession that he in fact did it, along with this fella, George Lincoln. Shortly after the Chillingworths got home from dinner, Floyd and George would kidnap the husband and wife. They tied their hands behind their backs, they gagged them, they then put a noose around each of their necks, tied that to cement blocks, forced them on a boat, drove out to the middle of the ocean, and forced them into the water while they were still alive. Their bodies have never been recovered. Judge Peel ordered the hit. He would be found guilty of accessory to murder, where he spent 18 years in jail. He got immunity, he got life. Hello and good evening. Rude. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 17th. What happened on June 17th? This is you. This guy was Eugen Weidmann. I'm sure I said that wrong, but who cares? He was a serial killer from Germany, also known as Germany. He kidnapped at least 6 people, and he strangled them all to death. He went on trial for 6 murders and was convicted, and he, well, let's just say he's not getting ahead in life. No. This is because on June 17th, 1939, in Versailles, France, he had his head whacked right off, just given the old broken celery stick. He gave head just in the really wrong way, and that's hard to do. He died, by the way. That's typically what happens when your head is removed. Speaking of missing limbs, something else happened on June 17th. On June 17th, 2008, along the beaches of Canada, specifically on Westham Island in British Columbia, a foot came washing up on shore. It wasn't the first. As a matter of fact, it was the 5th human foot to wash up on the shores near British Columbia. All of the feet were missing the rest of their bodies, and the majority of them were found in sneakers. Believe it or not, between 2007 and 2019, this happened 21 times. 21 human feet washing up on shore. All of them were confirmed to be human, and I know you want some big, deep mystery to come from this, but it's believed none of them came from foul play. As a matter of fact, about 15 of these feet have been identified to their original owner, and they were basically able to confirm, and I don't know how they were able to, but that all of these people died either of some sort of accident or by self-unaliving. So none of these people appeared to have been murdered. So, that's it. That's what happened on this day in true crime history, folks. Guess we'll see you for the next one or whatevs. Yeah, okay, great, cool. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 19th. What happened on June 19th? This was 6-year-old Teresa Cormack, born on June 18th, 1981. She lived here in Napier, New Zealand. The day after her 6th birthday, on June 19th, 1987, Teresa Cormack would go missing. Teresa would normally walk to school on her own because it was just down the road, but on June 19th, 1987, she never made it to school. She never got home, and no one would ever see her again. She was, of course, reported missing the day she disappeared, by her mom. The search began. They began looking everywhere for the little girl. Sadly, 8 days after she disappeared, they would find her. Laying underneath a tree at Whirinaki Beach would be the body of the 6-year-old Teresa Cormack. This poor little girl was sexually assaulted, and her cause of death was that she was likely strangled to death. And whoever did it left many pieces of themselves. There were 3 strands of pubic hair found in the little girl's underwear and also her mouth. They also found male bodily fluid, if you know what I mean, on her underwear and on her body. I don't get people. A 6-year-old little girl. It just gets so difficult at times. But they would collect all of this evidence, and DNA at the time was not as well established as it is, now. Back in 1987, they had a suspect, this guy right here. His name was Jules Mikus, and he had committed sexual assaults in the past. He gave his blood to police, and he gave them what they thought was an alibi. At the time, he was ruled out as a suspect, and for years her case went unsolved. In February of 2002, they would run the DNA again. And this time, because of the advancements, it matched perfectly to Jules Mikus. So 15 years after the murder, he would be arrested and tried, and he would be convicted of her murder. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder, and then 14 years each for the kidnapping and the assault. He could be paroled after 20 years, but he died in prison. What a shame. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 22nd, you think. What happened on June 22nd? Well, on June 22nd, 1981, this fella here, Mark David Chapman, would say that God told him to plead guilty and that he would never appeal his sentence. What did he do to plead guilty to? This was John Lennon, a member of the Beatles. And on December 8th, 1980, he would be gunned down outside of his apartment building by Mark David Chapman. Chapman had a lot of resentment and anger towards John Lennon. You see, Chapman was a godly fella, and he didn't like that John Lennon wasn't so godly. He didn't like the things that John Lennon and the Beatles had to say about God. There was also this whole thing about the Catcher in the Rye, how he emulated Holden Caulfield. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. He's still there. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 25th. What happened on June 25th? A few things. Let's discuss. This was a cottage by Lake Michigan, and it was owned by the Robinson family. I've actually covered their case on my page before, so this one will be brief. On the night of June 25th, 1968, the Robinson family would be gunned down in that cottage. Their murderer, who has still not been caught, used a couple different weapons to shoot them. Now, police did have one suspect, a man by the name of Joseph Scolaro, someone who worked with Mr. Robinson. He could not be accounted for about 12 to 15 hours on the day of their murders, and he owned the same type of weapons that were used to kill them. Unfortunately, detectives never had enough physical evidence to connect Scolaro to the family's murders, so charges were never officially pressed against him. He would end up going and ending his own life. Next, holy sh**, that is a head. Yeah. Jesus, and the ears. Holy Christ, dude. Jesus, someone should hang you. This is John Christie. He was born in 1899. Damn! He lived near Yorkshire, England, and he was a serial killer. He began murdering people in 1943. He would do so inside of his flat. He murdered somewhere around 8 different women, including his own wife. He would be nicknamed the Monster of Rillington Place. He hid at least a couple of their bodies in a crawl space in his flat. In 1953, he was finally caught, and he was convicted of all of the murders, and on June 25th, 1953, he was sentenced to hang by the neck. Womp womp. And finally, on June 25th, 1983, this sweet young girl would go missing. This was 4-year-old Nyleen Marshall. Her family went on a little trip to the Elkhorn Mountains, which is located in Montana, and when she went off to play with some friends, she vanished. And to this day, she has never been seen again. The entire area was searched, of course, over and over, but they never found her. They never established any genuine suspects. The family was cleared. In November of 1985, a mysterious and anonymous phone call was made to a national hotline for missing people, claiming that they were the ones to have taken her. 2 months before that, police received this letter. You can go ahead and pause and read. It's not the whole thing, but this person is claiming to have kidnapped her and decided to raise her on his own, or her own. The calls and the letters came from Wisconsin, but she has still never been found. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is June 27th. What happened on June 27th? Unfortunately, I do not have a photo of her, but this is the grave of Patty Elaine Higgins. She was born in Pittsburgh, but eventually by 1979 she would move to California. She would become a special education teacher at Brad Oaks Elementary School. On June 27, 1985, Patty was working late at her school. She was decorating the room, getting ready for summer vacation, and then she arrived back to her home sometime in the mid to late evening. Patty lived alone, and where she lived, she had no neighbors, because there was a real estate office on one side and like a construction site on the other side of her. Patty was expected back at school on July 2nd, 1985, but she never showed up. And then when she didn't show up again the following day, her coworkers became extremely concerned and thought something may have happened to her, so there was a wellness check done at her apartment. When police arrived, they were able to enter the apartment and they discovered a very bloody scene. Patty's partially clothed body was found lying on the bathroom floor. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear. The autopsy would show that she had also been sexually assaulted, and then from her home, there were valuables missing, so this was apparently a robbery. Police believe that this murder occurred on the night of June 27th, because after June 27th, no one had actually ever heard from Patty. This is a composite drawing of her killer. Does this composite drawing look familiar to you? Well, let me show you who it is. Patty Higgins' killer was the Night Stalker, aka Richard Ramirez. Now, eventually he would be arrested, and he was charged with 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, 14 burglaries. He was convicted of all of them, including the murder of Patty Higgins, and received 13 death sentences. But while awaiting execution, he died in his prison cell of B-cell lymphoma. What a tragedy. And that's what happened on this day in true crime history. Stay tuned for the next. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today, it's June 29th. What happened on June 29th? On the afternoon of June 29th, 1978, the body of actor Bob Crane would be discovered in his Scottsdale, Arizona apartment. Bob Crane's career in entertainment began in the 1950s as a radio personality. Later on, he would have guest starring appearances in popular TV shows. He then appeared on The Donna Reed Show, and his fame kind of just skyrocketed. And starting in 1965, he would be the star of the show Hogan's Heroes. During the run of Hogan's Heroes, he would end up marrying Patricia Olson, a co-star of his. Hogan's Heroes would wrap up in 1971, and there was some controversy surrounding Bob Crane. It would come out that Bob Crane liked to videotape some of his sexual escapades. Bob Crane had several relationships prior to Patricia Olson. He did have affairs. Now, he got the videotaping equipment from a friend of his, John Carpenter. No, not the filmmaker John Carpenter. That's what I was thinking when I was reading this story at first. But eventually Bob Crane would kind of call John Carpenter almost like his agent, and he would help film these sexual escapades. It's kind of weird, but Bob and Patricia would then end their marriage around 1977. After the end of Hogan's Heroes and the sex tape story, Bob Crane was having a hard time finding work, so eventually he would move out to Scottsdale, Arizona. And there he would self-produce a play. On the afternoon of June 29th, 1978, Bob did not show up for rehearsals for the play, so one of his co-stars went to his apartment, went inside, and she discovered a horrible scene. Obviously, I can't show it to you, but these are readily available online. She found Bob Crane's body lying in his bed with blood all over him. He was nearly unrecognizable. His face had been beaten in so badly. He also had an electrical cord tied around his neck. The police were awful. They just destroyed the crime scene. They walked through it without the proper protection. They let people in there who should not have been in there. The coroner would actually come in there and shave Bob Crane's head in the bed to look at his injuries. What? The rest of the apartment didn't yield much in terms of physical evidence. Police learned that Bob and John Carpenter may have had an argument the night before. Bob apparently wanted to end the friendship. Police looked at John Carpenter's vehicle and they found bloodstains inside. The blood type matched Bob Crane's. John Carpenter would be arrested and charged with his murder, but he would be acquitted. There just wasn't enough evidence against him. Now, Bob Crane's ex-wife, Patricia Olson, she was looked at very unfavorably by the Crane family. The only person who gained anything from Bob Crane's death was Patricia Olson. Since the divorce was still basically going on, with Bob Crane dead, there wouldn't be a divorce, which means she would get everything. And basically she did. Could she have asked John Carpenter to kill Bob? It's possible. Did John Carpenter kill Bob just out of anger for Bob wanting to end the friendship? It's possible. But here's the unfortunate thing. John Carpenter has since passed away. Plus, he would not be able to be recharged with the murder anyway since he was already acquitted due to double jeopardy. Patricia Olson has also passed away. And in 2007, they were able to try to retest some of the blood DNA found in John Carpenter's car. But since it was from all the way back in 1978 and the evidence wasn't handled perfectly, the DNA had essentially degraded. And by using the remainder of it to do this test in 2007, it's all gone now. Now they have no DNA to test. Essentially, they no longer have any physical evidence in the Bob Crane murder. The police in Scottsdale do essentially believe that John Carpenter murdered Bob Crane because of the argument, because he was seen at the apartment and because there was blood droplets in his car that matched the same blood type as Bob Crane. But, back in 1978, 1979, without any other physical evidence, because blood evidence back then was like nothing, they had to acquit him. But ultimately, in the end, we will likely never know who murdered Bob Crane.